Good evening, everyone. This is the first lecture in a series that we've decided to do on the history of Western architecture. The idea behind the series was that these were going to be basic lectures, introductory lectures for people who have little or no background in the subject, but also that might be suitable for people who do have background in the subject, but like an occasional refresher. So they're going to be pretty basic. And one thing I want to say at the outset, particularly pertaining to tonight's talk on Greek architecture, is that there is a lot of uncertainty about almost every aspect of ancient Greek architecture. There is uncertainty about attributions to architects and artists. There is uncertainty about dating. If, for example, you're interested in a particular Greek building and you go online in search of its dates, you're going to probably come up with, in any given case, 10 different dates. You consult books, you're going to find different dates. Tomorrow, some scholar is going to decide that we were off by 50 years or off by 120 years about a particular building. Also, architectural historians and archaeologists fight fiercely in the pages of scholarly journals about interpretations of this or that, how to interpret basic architectural elements and their derivations, how to interpret the content of friezes, what have you. And I want to say that it's not my purpose tonight to stake out any ground in these debates whatsoever. I'm going to give you what I think are the basics with which to begin, and with which to begin your own explorations into these subjects. So if you were, for example, to do some further reading about one of the buildings that I talk about tonight, and it completely contradicts what I tell you, that's good. I'm giving you the starting point, not the definitive answer. Now, as you can see, behind me is the main reading room of the New York Public Library. I've been using this as my Zoom background ever since I began to live on Zoom, which was 2 months ago. And I've now done about 50, counting my classes at NYU and lectures and this and that, I've done about 50 of these Zoom presentations. I know you're probably already thinking that I should be better at it than I am, but it's, probably going to take another couple of months before I'm fully adept. But in any event, I chose this background because it's, well, one of my favorite rooms in the world, but beyond that, it's appropriate for tonight. It's not what you'd call a Greek room. There are many, many elements to this building that derive from classical sources that are, well, post-Greek. But that said, the Greek elements are still all here. Decorative elements, ways of using the orders. If we were to go downstairs in this building to the corridors that lead off from the Astor Hall, the main entrance hall of the New York Public Library, the walls are actually lined with Pentelic marble imported from Mount Pentelicon in Greece. This is the marble that was used for the buildings of the Acropolis. The point that I'm making, that I'm going to make several other times during tonight's talk, is that we live with ancient Greece every day. We live with ancient Greece in so many different ways. We live with ancient Greece politically and emotionally. We live with it as well architecturally. And so this isn't a remote subject matter. This is something that should actually help you to derive greater enjoyment and understanding from the city for cities. Since we have an international audience tonight, that's one of the things you can do with Zoom, the cities around you. So without further ado, I'm going to do what in Zoom lingo is called sharing my screen. The architecture of classical Greece, an introduction. The picture that you see, by the way, is from a painting, which I'm going to show you a little bit later, by a man named Leo von Klenze, who was an excellent German, Bavarian architect in the mid-19th century. Here we see Greece. I'm sure that you all already have some basic notion of Greek geography. You know that there's the Aegean Sea on one side, the Ionian Sea on the other. And if you sort of focus on the center of this map and then move down and to your left ever so slightly, you will see Athens. A great deal of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is about Athens, but not all of it. And where I thought appropriate, I'm going to show you maps so that you have a sense of where in the Greek world the buildings are that I'm talking about. And I say the Greek world because the Greek world comprises much more than just Greece. It encompasses the islands around Greece, but also if you look to the right, you see where it says Asia Minor, Turkey. Many of the greatest, most important Greek buildings are in Turkey. And although it's not visible on this map, also this is the case with southern Italy and Sicily, where there were long-standing Greek settlements. So Greek architecture spans quite a realm, not as vast as the Roman architecture that I'll be talking about next week, but pretty vast nonetheless. So, as I say, some basics, real basics. These are the three periods that you need to know about if you want to talk about classical Greek architecture. There's the period that we call the Archaic period. And there is a period called the Classical period, which follows that. And what's a little bit odd is that there's a lot of architecture from the Archaic period that we nonetheless refer to as classical. And of course, all the architecture of the classical period is classical, and then the period that follows upon that, the Hellenistic period, is also classical. But historians and archaeologists do divide Greek history into these periods. Basic list of names, famous Greeks and their dates. These dates are very approximate. If I were being very scholarly, I would put C period in front of every number that you see, but I just want you to have kind of the basic lay of the land. Thales of Miletus, the top name on this list, is the person recognized generally as the father of Western philosophy. There are the great playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and right in the middle of those names is the name of the great Athenian statesman Pericles, the man who gave his name to a whole period in Greek history that we call Periclean Athens, which will get kind of disproportionate play in tonight's talk. The name after Euripides is Phidias, the great sculptor among the Greeks, and then there are the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the last name on the list, Zeno of Citium, the father of what we call Stoic philosophy. Some major events. When you're thinking about the architecture of ancient Greece, you're not necessarily always going to be thinking of where they fall in relation to these major events. Suffice it to say that the golden age of Greece, as we often think of it, Periclean Athens, was a very short-lived period in between wars, massive, bloody wars. There were a lot of those in Greek history, but it is the sort of peaceful interregnum that accounts for that disproportionate share of what is most important in Greek architecture and art. And you'll note also that Athens experienced a plague. I just thought that I would throw that in because these days we're very conscious of the history of infectious diseases. This is Raphael's great painting, The School of Athens, which depicts many of the great Greek philosophers. There is a key to this that you can find on Wikipedia, which is a great deal of fun. You can see who all of the philosophers are. What's so interesting about this painting, of course, is that although these are all Greek philosophers, note the setting in which Raphael places them. It is a very un-Greek setting. It is really an Italian Renaissance setting based on Roman and not Greek precedent. Why would he have done that? Why wouldn't he have shown them in a Greek setting? There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that I think he wanted to make the point that these philosophers, though remote in time, are in an important way our contemporaries. It's kind of like, you know, Shakespeare in modern dress, right? But there's another reason as well, and that is that Raphael had no idea what a Greek setting looked like. And if that seems remarkable, given that he was working in Italy, and that isn't so very far from Greece, you've got to realize that our understanding of Greek settings, of Greek architecture, of the artifacts of Greek civilization was extremely limited until the 18th century. And this is another theme that I will be discussing a little bit as we proceed, because it's actually rather important. There is a close-up showing the two giants of Greek philosophy, the two giants, indeed, of Western philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. It was the British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead who said, all philosophy since Plato is but a footnote to Plato. And I think that there's much to be said for that view. And it reminds us of just how important the Greeks were. This is now a map of Periclean Athens. Here you see the basic layout of the city. It wasn't a large city by present-day standards. It was perhaps half the size of Greenwich, Connecticut. How's that? This is not a megalopolis that we're talking about. We're talking about something that by our present-day definition would be a town, not a city. Nonetheless, by the standards of its day, it was a very important place indeed. It was the administrative center of much larger realm, and it was, and knowing that it was actually a rather small place makes it all the more impressive to us. When you think of sort of the concentration of genius in this small place, the ratio of genius to population, it's actually mind-boggling. So on the sort of just a little bit down into the right of center, you see the Acropolis, about which you will learn more. To the left of the Acropolis, the Areopagus, and just above that is the Agora. Um, and these are all places that are going to feature in what follows. Here I have arrows pointing to these things. The agora was the marketplace. That's where the sort of real life of the city took place. That's where you would go if you wanted to experience the hustle and bustle of Athens. If you wanted to run into people in the street, that is where you would go. The Acropolis, the religious center, by contrast, would have been rather dull. It wasn't where you went in order to experience the pulse of the city. It is rather where you went to commune with the gods. I have arrows pointing to the locations of the academy, which is associated with both Socrates and Plato. That was in the suburbs just outside the city. And then lower right, you see the Lyceum, where Socrates hung out, and which was later, of course, taken up by Aristotle. And you also see an arrow pointing to the Areopagus, the assembly of elders, more sort of the political heart, if you will, of Periclean Athens. Now I'm going to begin by some very sort of brisk survey of building types in ancient Greece. I'm not going to jump right in with the discussion of temples and the orders. That's going to come a little later. I want simply for you to know that there were indeed a variety of building types in ancient Greece, that this story isn't entirely about temples. It's only about 80% about temples. So there are, for example, the stoas. The stoas of ancient Greece. They were to be found in all the towns and cities in Athens. These were very important places. This is a stoa from the Hellenistic period, and one which was actually rebuilt. And here I should sound another very important theme at the outset, which is that none of these buildings exist intact. Some of them have been reconstructed. Some of them we know only through artists' renderings. Some of them we know really only through their ruins. And this is what accounts in large measure for all the sort of disputation and controversy about, the buildings, their purposes, their dates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the stoas were central to the public life of Athens. If you went to the agora, you would find, for instance, that there were many stoas all round the agora. These were covered walkways. They served basically as places for people to get out of the sun or the rain, places for people to mingle, to hang out, and various other purposes besides. I'm sure that on a rainy day, it's where you would find the Senegalese guys selling umbrellas. For instance, would be in the stoas. If you look at the top, there is a stoa called Stoa Poikile. And this was where the philosopher Zeno of Citium hung out and publicly philosophized in a way that would probably get him arrested today. But his school of philosophy became known as Stoicism, which derives from the word stoa. And there were, as you see all around, many of these stoas. The one which we just saw and which we are seeing again, the stoa of Adalos, was a later one, as I say, from the Hellenistic period, not from the classical period. It was a two-story stoa, which was not uncommon at that point, and it was rather grand. You can see that this was this reconstruction of the Stoa of Adalos is actually a building that if you were to plunk it down in, say, the middle of Pittsburgh today, would be probably the most distinctive building in the city. This is what it looks like in the inside of a Stoa. It's very nice. And in addition to Stoas, we all know that the Greeks were very big on theater. We know that Greeks basically invented Western drama, and the names of the Greek playwrights still are very meaningful to us. Many of us still attend productions or read the works of Aeschylus or Euripides or Aristophanes. And these were the works that were performed in these theaters. The theaters of ancient Greece were very impressive structures. They had seating for thousands of people. Some of the larger theaters, like the Theater of Dionysos, at its height could seat 18,000 people. Basically, these theaters could seat the number of people who lived in the city. Which is quite a remarkable thing and shows the centrality of theater to the lives of the people of the city. The theaters were often located near religious sanctuaries, and that too sort of underscores the importance, the centrality of theater to people's lives at the time. The theaters of ancient Greece had a basic common layout with that circular, semi-circular seating plan, the rate seating for the good sight lines. And then it had that large circular area in front of the seats where the chorus held forth. And we call that area by the name of orchestra. And then beyond that was the main stage. Here is the theater of Priene in present-day Turkey. The theaters have survived remarkably intact because sort of the nature of the beast, I think, all those the stone seating and the open space of the orchestra is just the sort of thing that survives the centuries pretty well. You feel when you see one of these Greek theaters that you could stage a performance in it as is, and you don't get that feeling about very many of the other ruins that you encounter in the Greek world. The theater at Miletus in Turkey, another view, you can see just how grand these theaters were. And this is an illustration of what the Theater of Dionysus, or Dionysos, which was in the southeastern corner of the Acropolis, looked like. You know, one of the things that a theater lover, likes to do when he walks around New York and passes where I live and passes a theater is to think of the great productions that took place there. I walk around and I think to myself, True West by Sam Shepard at its world premiere. Just to mention one recent experience that I had walking past the Cherry Lane Theater on Commerce Street. But when you're in Greece, you can actually walk past theaters and think, you know, wow, this is where Aristophanes' The Clouds. We don't know where it was first performed, but one of its early performances was there, and it kind of puts things in perspective for you. And then there is that building type called the Bouleuterion. What is a Bouleuterion? It was sort of the council house, is how it's often translated. Like the city council, the civic council, kind of like the city council chamber in an American city. In the democratic city-states of the Greek world, this was a very important place where issues were discussed and debated, and various things were adjudicated. This is the Boleterian in Priene. Again, see, very much like a theater. There was seating all around, and then there was a sort of central well where speakers held forth. So, as I say, similar to theaters. This is an illustration showing what the Boleterian in Miletus probably looked like. As with the theaters and as with the stoas, it was rather a grand structure. Everything was rather grand, except, as we shall soon see, the houses. This is the plan of Piraeus, the port of Athens, by a fellow named Hippodamus of Miletus, whom we sometimes call the father of urban planning, of Western urban planning. He is the person who absolutely was the father of the gridiron street plan. So if you're a New Yorker, for example, you know the New York street grid that was the result of the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. Well, the roots of that New York City street plan come from the city layouts of Hippodamus of Miletus. He was also, I think we could probably say, the father of zoning, person who felt that it should be official policy to separate one function from another within a city, not to jumble them all up. He's the father, in other words, of pretty much everything Jane Jacobs disapproved of. So anyway, you can see here the gridiron plan. Here's another view, simplified, schematized, of the same thing. The grid, that rectilinear gridiron street plan, that is one of our inheritances from the Greeks. Now, this is a house in a part of Greece where some really interesting archaeological work has been done. Olynthos in Chalkidiki, which is in the northern part of the country. This is very near the fabled Mount Athos. Here you see the courtyard of a house. The houses that people lived in, I said that most of the buildings of these Greek cities and towns were rather grand, and I said that is with the exception of houses. Much has been made of this over the years. It's been suggested that the Greeks simply weren't homebound people. They lived their lives in public, and they viewed their homes as dormitories. Maybe some truth to that, but I think that the story is probably a little more complicated. Houses very often were of 2 stories, as you can see. And at first blush, you might think houses built around courtyards, how nice. That courtyard must have been pleasant. You see the second story, it's like a balcony overlooking the courtyard, and this seems rather elegant to us. But do bear in mind that the courtyards were not pleasant places. They may have provided some light and air, but they were also places where, like people chopped up chickens and where people defecated and so on. So, they weren't great. So it might be, there's the location, by the way, of Chalkidiki. And this is the street plan of Olynthos, which was either by or inspired by Hippodamus of Miletus. Here we see the houses, and we've been able, not me personally, but archaeologists have been able, through a study of building foundations in Olynthos, to reconstruct the whole pattern of houses and streets of ancient Olynthos, which is pretty fantastic. But one of the things that Olynthos is very famous for and perhaps you've been there, is one of the things that has survived are these remarkable floor mosaics from the houses. Now, the houses, I should point out, were built of mud, brick, and wood. They were not the sorts of grand permanent structures that many of the principal stone buildings of the city were. And yet, there are instances where we know that they had some very rich decorative effects. Indeed, I think everybody here would agree that these floor mosaics count as rich decorative effects. This one depicting Bellerophon. So the floor mosaics of Olympos are really one of the major attractions for globe-trotting cultural enthusiasts. And there was always that room in the house where in the evenings the men would retire and conduct that soiree that we call a symposium. Perhaps you have read Plato's Symposium, my favorite of all his dialogues. And what was a symposium? Well, it's not what we would call a symposium. It's not like, you know, ICAA sponsors a symposium on postmodern architecture. No, it wasn't that kind of symposium. It was rather a certain kind of, how shall I say, party, where the men sort of hung out. They drank prodigious quantities of wine. And indeed, the ancient Greeks in general, certainly the Athenians, drank a lot. And women were permitted in the role of servants, or in this case, musicians. A girl playing the aulos, which was a woodwind instrument. And of course, at a symposium, as we know from Plato, as we know from Xenophon, the great conversation might take place, might or might not take place, but certainly the Greeks liked to converse and they liked to philosophize. What about women? The symposium was an exclusively male thing. And it was a rather male-dominated society, but there was one building type in Greek cities known as the fountain house that were female preserves. The fountain house is, as its name suggests, the place where the fountain was located. It's where you went to get water. And that was women's work. Women were the household members who went out and got the water. But these fountain houses, which could, as you can see from this model, be very attractive buildings, were also important places in the lives of these women because it is where they met and communed with other women and did so on a regular basis. So this is where women talked. This is where women shared child rearing tips. This is where women complained about their husbands. This is, in other words, this was the place where women got to sort of be on their own with other women. And thus they were very important places in the city. In this map, detail from the map that I showed you earlier, we see the locations of two fountain houses on the left, the southeast fountain house, and on the right, the southwest fountain house, in relation to, in this case, the South Stoa 1, and also the Iachean, which was sort of the courthouse. And this is a hydria. You see lots of these in the classical departments for our museums, like the Greek and Roman galleries of the Metropolitan Museum, or in this case, the British Museum, and it depicts a fountain house scene. So the figures are women. This is sort of a better view of the same thing. So let us move on to temple architecture, because temples were the place where people, well, I mean, they were where the cities invested the greatest resources in building. The top talent was put to work on temples, the greatest sums were expended on temples, and this is pretty much a theme throughout the history of Western architecture. Recently, for example, I taught a course on American architecture and urbanism, and at a certain point, one of the students said, are you ever going to talk about anything but churches? And I thought to myself, you know, you kind of like go years when you're studying architectural history, nothing but churches. And there's a good reason for that. It's that these were where the greatest resources were expended. This is where a very disproportionate share of the culture's architectural energy was put. And so it was with the Greeks and their temples. This is where the greatest architectural energy was invested, was in temple architecture. Now, this is something that I kind of want to get into because it actually becomes rather specialized, but mention of it must be made. The earliest Greek temples, all the way up to the Archaic period, were constructed not of stone. They were not stone buildings. They were wooden buildings. And we have a conjectural wooden temple visible at the top of the slide. It looks like a log cabin, doesn't it? Well, it is a log cabin, basically, but it has a very distinctive form. It has that porch. It has the columns all around the building. And you can see that it was built that way because that is the way you built with wood. It was a post and lintel construction of the sort that is suited to wood construction. And so it is that our understanding of the great Greek temples is that their forms and many of their details derived from wooden architecture, that is the ultimate source of the orders, which I will be discussing in just a moment. And then in the bottom half of the slide, you see the temple at Isthmia in the Peloponnese. This is an Archaic period temple. It's rather grand, and it shows the extent to which wooden temples could indeed become grand. And the wooden temples achieved a certain grandeur before stone construction came in. This slide, believe it or not, this comes from a video game. And I don't play video games. I'm going to come clean with you. I have never played a video game, but I found this. There's a video game and called, maybe you know it, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I'd never heard of it before, frankly, from 2018, but various ancient Greek settings were recreated for it. Now, I don't know how much scholarship went into this, but goodness, these are vivid images. This is that temple that I just showed you, the temple at Isthmia, a wooden temple. And you can see that it is certainly rather grand. But the temples with which we are most familiar, the temples, the ruins of which still exist, the temples that are the canonical works of Western architecture are stone temples. And there was that certain point where the Greeks decided that the wooden temples wouldn't do. Wooden buildings seldom do because they are prone to deterioration and burning down and what have you. And so they were, as it were, translated into stone. And the translations were pretty literal translations. The post and lintel architecture that was suited to wood construction was simply transposed to the new stone idiom. And we call this by the name of trabeation. So there is probably your first big vocabulary word that you need to remember in relation to classical Greek architecture. It simply means post and lintel construction. And this is wooden architecture that has been, as I say, translated or transposed to stone. Vocabulary words. These are basic. They are very, very basic. If you don't know them at all, they may seem a little daunting, but they're not. Basically, we use these words in describing buildings, in describing temples, or anything which has a temple-like form. If a building in the front of it has two columns, we call it distyle. It has three columns, tristyle, four columns, tetrastyle, then pentastyle, hexastyle, heptastyle, and so on. As I say, very basic and very easy to find such a list on the internet. And here are a few other common terms that are very basic in the identification of a temple or temple-like buildings. A building that has columns only in the front, we call a prostyle building. If it has columns in the front and in the rear, we call it amphiprostyle. If there is a single row of columns that surrounds the building, we call it peripteral. I don't know if you're like me, but I just love words where a T follows a P. They're just such a pleasure to enunciate. And then dipteral means a double row of columns all around the building. But then there is what we call pseudo-peripteral, and that means that there are columns in the front and rear, but there are not freestanding columns, but what we would call engaged columns, or columns that are embedded into the wall, or something that kind of faintly evokes a column on the side, so that it's not really a peripteral temple, but we call it pseudo-peripteral. And then there is that thing called the tholos, which is columns in the round. And we'll see an example of that in just a moment. Here are the plans of many of those. You see at the top center, there is a tholos. Now, when you look at the plans of a Greek temple, you look for those big black dots. Big black dots are always columns. Those are where the columns are. And this ancient Greek architecture is a matter of columns. Above all else, it's about columns. So there you see the columns are in a circle. To its right, you see a prostyle temple. And because there are 4 columns in the front, that's actually a tetrastyle prostyle temple, and that's how we say it. That's how we say it. You know, you actually like get up in front of a classroom and you say, this is a tetrastyle prostyle temple. And you have the 4 dots at the bottom, that's the 4 columns in the front. And then to the right of that, 4 columns on the bottom, 4 columns on the top, meaning front and back. So tetrastyle, amphiprostyle temple, and so on. You see the second from the left in the bottom row. That's peripteral, and you see that there are the black dots all around the building. They completely surround the building, but they are set out from the wall, so those are freestanding columns. You see that to its right, there's pseudo-peripteral, and you see that the columns, the black dots, aren't separated out from the wall. The black dots are kind of embedded in the wall, sort of half embedded in the wall, pseudo-peripteral. This is the Parthenon, the most famous of all Greek temples, maybe the most famous building in the Western world. And you see its plan. The Parthenon is an octastyle peripteral temple. And I do have a red arrow that I've drawn on the slide pointing to the central space within the temple, the cella, and more on that to come. So here is a photograph of a peripteral temple, the Temple of Hephaestus in Athens. And you can see what I mean. There are the columns supporting the roof, but the cella is inside those columns. It's almost like an open space, almost like a stoa, all the way around the temple. And then there is this structure in the middle. Of course, it's part of the general structure, but it's also something which is set apart. It's a very specific enclosure which is surrounded by those columns. On the left, there is a pseudo-peripteral heptastyle temple, the temple of Zeus in Agrigento. And then on the bottom, peripteral hexastyle temple. Agrigento is part of Magna Graecia, the Greek settlements in Italy. That is the Temple of Concordia. Tetrastyle, the Temple of Athena Nike in the Acropolis in Athens. A hexastyle temple, the Temple of Hera at Paestum, from circa 460 BC. Hexastyle, 6 columns in the front. Here's 7 columns, just in case you were thinking to yourselves, I can't imagine a temple front with an odd number of columns. There is such a thing. This is a heptastyle temple, which we just saw, Zeus Olympius in Agrigento. The Parthenon is, as I said before, octastyle. And here is an example, plan, and the foundation of a decastyle, 10 columns across the front, decastyle dipteral. In other words, this was the real column lovers temple, the temple of Apollo Didyma near Miletus in present-day Turkey. Now look at this. This has 2 columns, so you all already know that we would call that distyle, di-style, 2 columns. Style, by the way, means column. Think of a stylus. A stylus is a narrow cylindrical thing, like the stylus, the Apple Pencil that you use with an iPad. We also call by the name stylus. And so when we use the word style, of course, has many meanings, but basically it refers to columns. And when a building is called a stylar, it doesn't mean, oh, this building doesn't have a style. It means this building has no columns. That is what a stylar means. So distyle, 2 columns, is what that means. This is the Athenian treasury at Delphi, and it has 2 columns. But it also has, on the sides, those sort of big, blocky piers, if you will, that we call by the name ante. Anta, singular, ante, plural. And now the ante are the forerunners of something which you will learn next week. The Romans developed into what we call pilasters. The Greeks did not use pilasters as such, although they began the development of their ante, as we'll see, in that direction. But this particular kind of temple front we call distyle in antis, 2 columns between sort of bookending ante. And here's the ruin of a tholos, the sanctuary at the sanctuary of Athena Pronaia in Delphi, very right next to the treasury, you can see that there are the column stubs all round. And this is an artist's rendering of what that might have looked like. And what a remarkable structure it is. I mean, this really seems quite well on the road to the Romans, but a circular building. We just don't think of the Greeks as being circular people, but they were, and you'll see that in a moment. Here again, the map of the Acropolis. Not again. I don't think I showed a map of the Acropolis earlier. I showed a map that the Acropolis was on, but this is the Acropolis itself, that religious center of Athens. And you see that on the left is the gateway, which was called the Propylaea. Below that, it says Temple of Victory. That is what we call the Temple of Athena Nike. There was a theater just below that. And then when you passed through the Propylaea, you came to the two great buildings, Parthenon and the Erechtheum. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you see the Theater of Dionysos. This is quite an ensemble of buildings. Here we see it in an isometric rendering. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on the Parthenon and on the Erechtheum. This is that painting with which we began, but here you get to see it in color. This is the Acropolis at Athens from 1846 by Leo von Klenze. And this is another marvelous picture by Marcel Noël Lambert, showing the Acropolis as he believed it looked circa AD 161. This was from 1877. Lambert was an instructor at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and a Prix de Rome winner. And here, based on the Leo von Klenze painting, we see the locations of the Propylaea, the Erechtheum, and the Parthenon. So let's begin with Doric temples. I'll talk a little bit about Doric temples and about the Doric order, and then I will talk a little bit about Ionic temples and about the Ionic order, and then I will finish up with some odds and ends, particularly tombs and choragic monuments. Here we see the three orders, and when I just said I'm going to talk about the Doric order and then I'll talk about the Ionic order, you may have thought to yourself, whoa, isn't he going to talk about the Corinthian order? And not really. And I'm going to mention it, don't worry. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Today I want to sort of reserve discussion of the Corinthian for next week and the Romans. And the reason for that is that although the Greeks invented the Corinthian order, they did not use the Corinthian order very often. The Romans, on the other hand, fell in love with the Corinthian order, and it basically became the symbol of their glory. They used it all the time. For the Greeks, however, it was Doric and Ionic. And everybody can identify the orders by the style of column capital. You can usually identify the Doric order by that very simple slab-like capital. You might run into some problems later on when you learn that there is an order with a somewhat similar capital called the Tuscan order. You needn't worry about that now. And then, of course, you identify the Ionic order by those scrolls, the voluted capital, and you identify the Corinthian by that sort of great mass of foliage at the top. And these all have a different effect on us. We know that the Doric is very, kind of rough and ready and soldierly, to use a word that has been applied to it over the years. The Ionic is this sort of very elegant, but still reserved thing, and the Corinthian is this kind of, more go for broke kind of thing, which has been variously identified over the years with the Virgin Mary, or in the words of Horace Walpole, wanton courtesan. This is the Parthenon, the most famous Doric building in the world, the most famous Greek temple. As I said, arguably the most famous building in the Western world. We know who its architects were, Iktinos and Callicrates. We know that the sculptor Phidias, the greatest of Greek sculptors, was in charge of the decoration and may indeed have been sort of like the overseer of the whole project. And you figure that the Parthenon is a ruin today because it's so old, right? It rains and, this and that, and buildings just deteriorate. But a great part of the reason for the present state of the Parthenon is that it was actually bombed to rubble by the Venetians in 1687. We needn't go into all the whys and wherefores of that, but had that not occurred, the Parthenon would be much more intact than it is. We know a lot about what the Parthenon looks like because of sort of scholarly reconstructions in images that are based on ancient descriptions of the Parthenon, images which are based on deductions from what exists of the Parthenon, whether it be in Athens or in the British Museum, and so on, so that we have actually a pretty good idea of what the Parthenon looked like when the Parthenon was new. And it looks very little like the ruin of the Parthenon. The people, first and foremost, whom we have to thank for our understanding of what the Parthenon is really all about, were a couple of Englishmen in the 18th century, James Stewart and Nicholas Revet, or Revet. You will hear his name pronounced both ways. Americans tend to say Revet, English tend to say Revet, but however that may be, let's call him Revet, just to make things easy. Stewart and Revet were young men who, in the 1750s, set out for Greece. They were both very cultured young gentlemen. Stewart had actually worked in Italy as a tour guide, or cicerone, and together they ventured to Greece. Why should this be remarkable? Greece, you've got to understand, wasn't part of the grand tour. Well-born young Englishmen went on the grand tour. They visited Europe. They visited the cultural sites of Italy, of Switzerland, of France. They would go to Germany. They would go to Spain, but they wouldn't go to Greece. And the reason they didn't go to Greece, and the reason, or one of the reasons, that we knew so little about Greek material culture is that Greece was a very dangerous place to go. It was a difficult place to go, and if you did go to Greece, as Stewart and Revet did in the 1750s, it was a very adventurous thing to do. But following Stewart and Revet, this would change. Stewart and Revet spent a good chunk of time in and around Athens. They drew the ruins. They produced remarkably evocative drawings such as this of the Parthenon. You can see through the screen of its colonnade the mosque that existed at the time that Stewart and Revet were there. And if you look at the details in Stewart and Revet's drawings, the people who are depicted, it's just such a marvelously evocative thing. I could look at these pictures all day, but truly what is, and then they produced several volumes. The first two are the ones which are crucially important of folio called the Antiquities of Athens. And you cannot really spend much time on Greek architecture without consulting the Antiquities of Athens. God knows that after these volumes were published, architects consulted them regularly. The Philadelphia architect William Strickland, who designed the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, once said that the architect need go no further than the Antiquities of Athens. In other words, who would even think of designing a building that wasn't based on one of the plates in the Antiquities of Athens? But they're just wonderful volumes to browse in and also to learn from. And this is why. It's not just those marvelously evocative scenes, such as the one that I just showed you, but the measured drawings that they produced of these great Greek monuments that showed what they looked like originally. And this is what the Parthenon looked like originally. You can see that it's very different, both from the ruin of the Parthenon, but also very different from the countless buildings that were built in, quote, imitation of the Parthenon, such as we find right here in the United States, and you find all over the world. Because there was a certain misapprehension about Greek art. This was shared by the father of art history, Winkelmann, that Greek art was to be prized for its quality of chasteness and purity, almost as though you were talking about Mies van der Rohe. No, Greek architecture wasn't like that. Greek architecture may have been trabeated architecture, but it wasn't chaste. It was a highly decorated architecture, and this is a point that can't be stressed too much. Everybody knows this who's visited the Elgin Marbles in the British Museum, but here we see, for example, in the triangular pediment of the building, the wealth of sculptural detail and all of it figurative sculpture. Human form and animal form are paramount in the sculpture. So when you look at the front of a Doric temple, here are the things that you are looking for. First of all, point needs to be made. When we speak of the orders, we are not speaking of the column. We are not, much less of the column capital. We're speaking of an ensemble of vertical and horizontal. We're speaking of the columns plus the thing that the columns hold up, the tabletop, as it were, the thing that we call the entablature. And if you look at the word, you see that it is N, then T-A-B-L, like table, which is what entablature means. That is its, it means table. So it's like the tabletop, and the columns are like the table legs. An entablature in classical architecture is divided into 3 horizontal sections, and each one of these sections has a name. There's nothing in architecture that doesn't have a name. The 3 horizontal divisions of the entablature are, right above the columns, the architrave. Right above that, the frieze. And in the Doric order, the frieze is decorated. We'll get to that in a second. And then above the frieze is an overhanging eave that we call a cornice. Now, everybody knows from cornices, right? Then there is a bit above the cornice is the gable end of the roof, okay? The gable end of the roof can be, as we say in architecture, it can be articulated in a particular way. If you sort of enframe it in cornices, and when the cornice slants, as it does on both sides of this gable end of the roof, we call the cornices raking cornices. And this transforms the gable into something that we call a pediment. And within the pediment is a space, the space that is framed by the cornices. And that space is called a tympanum. The tympanum was conceived by Greek architects generally to be space for sculptural imagery, for relief sculpture, sculpture based on the human form. And what an art pediment sculpture is. Indeed, there are few things in life that are more thrilling than good pediment sculpture, seriously. And very hard to do. Hard to do because when you get to the far ends, you have those very narrow spaces, and you've got to make people lie down. And you see that over and over and over again in these pediment sculptures, and the ingenious ways in which sculptors have managed this feat is, as I say, nothing short of thrilling. And then just below that, in the part that we call the frieze. The frieze in a Doric temple in the Parthenon consists of two basic elements. One arrow, on the bottom left, you see a word triglyph. 3 marks is what that means. And those 3 vertical bars, which the red arrow points. That is a division in the frieze that we call a triglyph. And then in between the triglyphs is a square space. And in the lower right, you see the word metope, which we pronounce metope. And the red arrow, which points from that word, points to another relief sculpture. So in the Parthenon, the metopes are filled with relief sculpture. So these are the important terms to note. This is a model of the Parthenon. There are models of the Parthenon all over the place, but this is a nice model of the Parthenon, which is to be found in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And this is a model of the Parthenon. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. They went and rebuilt the Parthenon. And people make fun of this all the time. And I don't know why. I don't know why people make fun of it. And people say, oh, have you seen the Parthenon in Nashville? It's a marvelous thing. I mean, there's nothing else in the world that gives us as vivid a sense of what the Parthenon was like. This is just like that model in the Carnegie Museum, but it's writ large, and there's a place for this sort of thing. So I don't chuckle at the Nashville Parthenon at all. I tell people to go see it. It is, as I say, a marvelous thing, and I'm just throwing in this picture because I happen to be a big fan of the architectural renderings of Alexander Jackson Davis from the first half of the 19th century, and he drew this lovely picture of the Parthenon. So here we see up close the columns of the Parthenon, and you can see that they are very simple, they are very plain, but the longer you look at them, the more complex they are. Here are some other terms that you should know. First of all, at the bottom are 3 terms with red arrows pointing to different parts. The top of the column. One word is neck. Neck. It's like your neck, which points to the neck of the column. And then there's the word echinus, which points to the swelling bit that circles the column top above the neck, and then the sort of square slab-like form at the top of the column we call an abacus. And then in the entablature, right underneath the frieze, you always see these things in architecture, and people tend to use the all-purpose word doohickey to describe these things, but you see these sort of little peg-like forms that are called gutty is the plural, gutta is the singular, and then in between them the narrow horizontal band, which we call tinea, and then the sort of rectangular or square blocks under the cornice are called mutuals. This is a Parthenon column capital in the British Museum. It can be studied up close, and what a marvelous thing it is. Just look at how delicately it is modeled. The carving of it, the surfaces of it, although this is a rather plain and even severe order of architecture, sort of the almost very sensual way in which this is carved sort of betrays that. And it's really very, very elegant. It's a beautiful thing. Now, here we must say something about something that you'll often have heard people say, which is that although a building like the Parthenon seems so rectilinear, it is in fact not. You'll hear said, perhaps by a tour guide in the Acropolis, that there are no straight lines in the Parthenon. It's designed so that it looks like there are straight lines, but it's an optical illusion, because there are a lot of optical corrections that are made in order to keep the building from looking that it is like it is not rectilinear. And these are done through the raising of the cornice, the raising of the architrave, the raising of the syllabate. And then there is that beast that we call entasis. You will often hear people pronounce this word entasis or entasis, but the correct pronunciation is entasis. Entasis is from the Greek word which means to stretch or to strain. And we're always taught that this too is an optical correction, which clearly it often is. It keeps the column looking straight. What is it? It is that sort of slight, or in the case of the Temple of Hera at Paestum, not so slight, bulging of the column. Look at those columns, and you'll see that they are not straight up and down. They bulge. And if it's an optical correction, why in some instances is the bulge so pronounced? Why? There's the Vincent Scully thesis. He was a great architectural historian at Yale, and he suggested that the real purpose of entasis was less to correct optical illusions than it was to create a greater sense of weight, hence the derivation of the word, to stretch or to strain. The Greeks wanted their buildings to have a feeling of weight, to have a feeling sort of that to make you feel rather as though you were holding up the building. This we place under the general heading of empathy in art or architecture, that projection of the states of the human body onto buildings. This, at least, was the Scully thesis. There is the Parthenon there. You see, this worked. I'm so excited. You see, there's the ruin, and there we see the completion of the building and the way that it actually was meant to be. Every time I get one of these effects to work in PowerPoint, I get so excited. Anyway, this is a wonderful painting by Lawrence Alma-Tadema, Phidias showing the frieze of the Parthenon to his friends. And speaking of the frieze of the Parthenon, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire between 1799 and 1803 was this fellow named Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin. And he was, how shall we say, a thief. This too is a very controversial thing, a can of worms you don't really want to get into, but the point is that if you want to study Greek architecture, you don't have a choice. You have to go to London. Now, you not only have to go to Greece, you have to go to London. You have to go to the British Museum, where it's like this treasure house of Greek architecture, elements that were basically made away with by Lord Elgin. And there were others as well. He wasn't the only one, but he got this great bounty of stuff from the Parthenon, which include the so-called Elgin marbles and much more. There's the plan of the Parthenon. This is a rendering of the Propylaea from a book by, we'll get to that. This British Museum. Okay, late Archaic, early Classical, the Temple of Aphaia at Aegina. And this is rendering of what that temple might originally have looked like. Aegina is just in a little bit south of Athens. And this is a reconstruction of the east pediment of the Temple of Aphaia. And if you were to go to the Glyptothek in Munich, you'll see a lot of artifacts from that particular temple, including this fallen warrior. And here we see where the fallen warrior is. But look at the figures in the pediment, and you see that not only is that pediment the pictures at the Antiquities of Athens showing us that the pediment is filled with sculpture, but the sculpture, moreover, was polychrome, as we say. It was colored. And another term for you to note, the ornaments which are placed at the ends and at the apex of the pediment are called acroteria. Singular is acroterion, and the plural is acroteria. So, Temple of Hephaestus in Athens. This was illustrated in the Antiquities of Athens, and something which is quite remarkable is that the co-author of the Antiquities of Athens, the British architect James Stewart, who was known as Athenian Stewart, although the Temple of Hephaestus would be a very influential building once it was published in the second volume, 1787, of the Antiquities of Athens, its fame would spread throughout the Western world. Athenian Stewart, who'd not yet published it, but who'd seen it, who'd drawn it, borrowed from it when he created this folly in this garden in Worcestershire. And if you want to see the Temple of Hephaestus as through the influence of the Antiquities of Athens, you can do so right here in New York at this 13th Street Presbyterian Church, where, by the way, that's all wood. And this comes from a book by Julien David Leroy, a Frenchman who actually beat Stewart and Rivette to Greece, published his own book before Stewart and Rivette could publish theirs. So there was this great competition between Stewart and Rivette and Leroy, and man, they really bad-mouthed each other. But that's a story for another day. Let me simply try to get through the rest of the material as quickly as I can here so that you can all, eat dinner. But this is the Ionic order, may be based on whelk shells. Why not? And this is one of the early great Ionic temples. This is the 5th Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. This is a reconstruction of it, which is in Istanbul. Ephesus was in Turkey. And the 4th temple of Artemis at Ephesus is the one which actually has the pride of place in architectural history for having been one of the very small handful of first Ionic temples to be built. But the fifth, which has been reconstructed here, is actually very similar to the fourth in appearance. There it is up close, and you can see the distinctive voluted capitals of the Ionic order. This is the image from Sir Bannister Fletcher's A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method. And you see that it has not only the distinctive voluted capitals, but unique column bases with relief sculpture, which you can study up close. Guess where? At the British Museum. And this is the greatest Ionic building of them all, the Erechtheum. Lavoie's rendering of the Ionic order of the Erechtheum. I think that the Ionic columns of the Erechtheum are one of the most beautiful things in the history of Western civilization. What a great picture. This is one of those sort of vignettes from the Antiquities of Athens. Just great. But here's the column. Look at the column. This is in the British Museum, where you can really study this stuff up close. And you see how distinctive this is, all the detail. You see, for example, that the abacus is ornamented with an egg and dart molding. You see the volutes, as we call them, of the capital, the sort of scrolled wheels. And you see how precise and tight the channeling of those volutes is. They look like they're really sort of wound tight. You see that wonderful braided band, the bead and reel moldings, which are on the sides of the volutes. You see the necking with the palmettes, and you see that the echinus is an egg and dart molding. Now, these things are not standard in the Ionic order. The volutes are standard in the Ionic order, but there is a whole host of embellishment that goes on in different interpretations of the Ionic order, and this is the Ionic of the Erechtheum, as we call it. And it's a very influential Ionic order, which was widely imitated. But also on the Erechtheum are these things that are column-like, but not actually columns. They are statues in place of columns, female statues in gowns. We call them caryatids. And they are astonishingly beautiful. Study them up close in the British Museum. I mean, you know, Lord Elgin really made away with a lot of stuff. These are actually in Athens. These are in the Acropolis Museum. The originals, which were not taken by Lord Elgin, have been moved indoors, and there are replicas outside. And you can see marvelous caryatids in New York that are to some extent inspired by those of the Erechtheum. They are by J. Massey Rhine at Macy's, the 34th Street entrance. This is a frieze fragment in the British Museum. And again, you see the classical moldings, the palmettes, the bead and reel, the leaf and dart, and the egg and dart moldings. And here we see that Athenian Stuart applied the Ionic of the Erechtheum to a house that he designed on St. James's Square in London, Lichfield House. But Theophil Hansen, a Danish-born architect, was asked to design a new building for the Academy of Athens in 1859. And he employed the Ionic of the Erechtheum, but he also chose to use polychromy in the manner that he thought was used originally at the Erechtheum. This is a very valuable thing to see. And right here in New York, there is this townhouse, 926 Fifth Avenue between 73rd and 74th Streets by C.P.H. Gilbert. And what do you have? A beautiful rendering of the Ionic of the Erechtheum. Now, here is my view. When I've looked at the Ionic capitals of the Erechtheum, and then I have looked at the Caryatids, one of the things that I love about those Ionic capitals is the tight channeling and then the rather fabric-like quality. It's like a drapery, the way that in the center the drapery droops. And then when I look at the Caryatid, I see the woman's gown, and I see that it's falling, drooping, the drapery is right in the center under her neck, just like in the column. And it's almost at the same pitch as in the column. And then the fabric pulls up and sort of wraps around her breasts, which are like the volutes of the capital. And I am struck, no particular interpretation to place upon this, but I am struck by the parallel between those two things. And they're both just so gloriously beautiful. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art from the Temple of Artemis at Sardis, not the one at Ephesus, but Sardis. And here, right in New York, you can study this great, originally 58-foot high Ionic column right in the Met. And you can sort of pick out its elements. It's a very elaborate order, but it isn't anywhere near as beautiful as the Erechtheum columns, and we see them side by side. Just look at that, that beautiful, elegant way that the volutes sort of lead to that drop in the middle, and then compare it with the one from Sardis, which just by comparison seems so workmanlike. Bottom of the capital is the Taurus, and we see that those can be decorated in very different ways. Now, the Temple of the Ilisos is another temple that was illustrated by Stewart and Rivette. It is a very much simpler Ionic order from that of the Erechtheum. But it has, at the abacus level of the column, what we call an ovolo. That word derives, obviously, egg. So it has that egg-like swell, and then that same ovolo molding appears at the tinea. And other than that, the column is very much simpler than the Erechtheum. And this became, see them side by side. You see how comparatively simpler the Temple of the Ilisos is from the Erechtheum. And the Temple of the Ilisos order was sort of illustrated from Stewart and Rivette by people like who produced pattern books in America, like Minard Lefevre, and it became the basic Ionic order, which was applied all over the New World. We see it, for example, in this row house on Washington Square North in Greenwich Village. And then there is the Temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassae in the Peloponnese, which is an intriguing temple because it is the only known temple to employ Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. There is a map showing where Bassae is located. This is what its ruin stabilization looks like today. Marble frieze in, guess where? The British Museum. This is the temple plan. Now you'll notice that there are the black dots around the perimeter. Those were Doric columns. And then the columns right in the center, in the interior, were Ionic. But then you notice that lone and lonely dot, which is just left of center between the numbers 2 and 3. That lonely black dot. That was a single Corinthian column. And we see that it was illustrated by the great 19th century British architect Charles Robert Cockerell, who, by the way, was the fella who coined the term Greek revival. First known use of the term Greek revival was in a speech or a lecture by Cockerell. And this is Cockerell's rendering of what the inside of that temple looked like. There are the Ionic columns, and there is that lone Corinthian column with a statue off-center just to its right. Now, this was based on very sound conjecture about what this temple actually looked like, and isn't it fascinating? He visited, by the way, Cockerell, Bassai in 1811 to 12, and sort of in the spirit of Lord Elgin, made off with all sorts of stuff. But it's the Ionic order of Bassai which is so interesting. Here is a third. After the Erechtheum and after the temple on the Ilisos, there is the Ionic of the Temple of Apollo Epicurus. We see that order with the sort of, I always think of it as this very flouncy sort of Ionic was employed by Cockerell at his most famous building, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but we can see it as well at Union Station in Washington, D.C., and illustrated in an American book, The American Vignola by William R. Ware. So a few things with which to conclude, and I'm going to conclude at some point, are ornaments. People use the words anthemion and palmette interchangeably, and I don't think they should. I think that an anthemion is based on a honeysuckle, a palmette is based on a palm, and what this means to me is that in the anthemion, the leaves are inward turning. In a palmette, the leaves are outward turning. And then the third thing that you see here is an acanthus leaf. Acanthus is a Mediterranean plant. The Greeks rendered acanthus a little bit differently from the Romans, a little bit differently from the Italians of the Renaissance, but acanthus, it all is, and it has been said that there is nothing that is more distinctive to Western art and architecture than the acanthus leaf. We see it everywhere, but I will talk about it more next week. And to make my point, a Mediterranean dwarf palm on the right with the leaves outward spreading, and an Etruscan honeysuckle on the right with the inward turning. Tombs. And we're very nearly done. An artist's recreation of the tomb of King Mausolus at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, as, by the way, was the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. So tonight we've seen 2 of the wonders of the ancient world. This was a very grand Ionic tomb. And if you want to see statues, probably, we don't know for sure, of Mausolus and his wife Artemisia, got to go to the British Museum. And the mausoleum of Halicarnassus was the model for John Russell Pope's Temple of the Scottish Rite in Washington, D.C. But this, everybody, even more than the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, this is what I call an altar. This is the Pergamon altar in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Some of you maybe saw that incredible show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art just a few years ago on Pergamon and Hellenistic art. They weren't able to transport this from Berlin, where much of Pergamon is now to be seen in a wonderful museum, but this altar is absolutely staggering, and it reminds us, the reason that I'm showing it is that the centrality of sculpture to Greek architecture is a key thing, always to bear in mind, and something to bear in mind going forward as we study other forms of classical architecture. And finally, there are these things that we call, now this is another word for which there are variant pronunciations. I was taught 40 years ago to say choragic, but some people say choragic. I was at a conference recently and people said Koregic, but Koragic. Let's just, for simplicity's sake, say Koragic. The Koragic monument, Trasilis, from Athens. What was a Koragic monument? It was a monument built in honor of a choragus, which was a choir master. So this is a simple monument topped off by a statue. And it's interesting because it has something that you don't often see. Normally, gudi are very discrete. You see the continuous on the left, top left, the continuous tinea, and then the gudi below it, which are, you see a few of them, and then there are none, and then there are a few, and then there are none. It's discontinuous. But bottom right, you see, if you look very closely, where the red arrow is pointing, you see that the gudi are continuous all the way across. This was taken up by Henry Bacon when he designed the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The gudi are continuous, and he also employed the wreaths that are to be found on the Koragic monument of Trasilis. So Henry Bacon was probably looking at the plates in the Antiquities of Athens, and this was as late as 1914. This isn't in the heat of the Greek revival in 1832. This is in 1913. There's the statue, and if you want to see the actual statue, guess where you got to go? To the British Museum. And then there are ante. This is another thing that I find very interesting about the Koragic monument of Trasilis, and that is that the ante, which are normally in Greek architecture just simple piers, actually are given capitals. And this is where we sort of see the beginnings of the the pilasters. Sorry. God knows how many times tonight I've said the wrong word, not known that I was doing it. Pilasters that the Romans would run with, as we shall see. And then there's the Koragic monument of Lysicrates. What a great picture from the Antiquities of Athens. When Stuart and Rivette visited Athens in the 1750s, was published in 1762, but they were there in the 50s, the Koragic monument was actually sort of embedded in the middle of a French monastery. And there's the sleepy-eyed monk in the front. God, what a great picture this is. But this is what it looks like today. The monastery's gone, but the Koragic monument is still there. What's special about this? It certainly doesn't look like anything special. So much of the detail has worn off over the years. It's a little sad. But this is how Stuart and Rivette figured it looked originally. And what it features so prominently and so beautifully are these things: Corinthian columns. A very beautiful and florid version of the Corinthian column, and I thought that that was the best place with which to conclude tonight's talk about Greek architecture, because the Corinthian will figure very largely in the story of Roman architecture. And here we see one of the greatest of all Roman buildings, the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, a building about which I will talk next week. And I very much hope that you will all be back next week and for the talks which have not yet been announced, but will be, and that will follow. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.